my beautiful buds. Welcome back to my channel, Sprouts with Joy. My name is Joy, and if you like to talk about plants, you're in the right place. Now, I remember when I was a beginner plant parent, I was just really getting into the idea of collecting houseplants as a hobby and taking care of plants. And I was sort of in that in-between period of time where I kind of felt ready to graduate from your standard pothos and philodendron Brazil and Monstera deliciosa and succulents and, you know, all the plants that I could pretty easily find in big box stores and had in my collection at the time. So I was feeling ready to get into plants that were a little bit more expensive and plants that were a little bit more uncommon or rare, but I felt this sense of terror, or maybe not terror, or maybe anxiety is a better word for it, where I really wanted to get into these plants and break into that territory, but I felt really intimidated because, you know, they cost a lot of money, and my assumption was that, man, am I gonna need to get all these humidifiers and greenhouse cabinets and grow lights to make this work, to make these plants work? Are they gonna be really prone to rotting on me? Are they gonna be really difficult to care for and complicated? Stuff like that. And obviously when you're gonna be spending a lot of money on a plant, it's a little bit scary to be putting money into a plant that you think might croak on you, you know? So I just wanted to make this video for people that are wanting to get into houseplants that go beyond just the beginner houseplants, but like don't really know what to get. Or if you're just curious about what I have to say on the topic, you're welcome to watch too, obviously. Now, I do have a couple of disclaimers. The first one being that obviously the term rare is sort of an interesting term in the plant world, because in reality, they're maybe more commercially rare in that they're more expensive. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're like actually botanically rare. And also, what's rare and what's not and what's uncommon and stuff like that sort of thing is constantly changing. But all the plants I'm talking about today, at the time that I started collecting houseplants, they were considered more rare or uncommon. At this point in time, some of them have definitely gotten more accessible, which is good news for you because that means that they're going to be a little bit more inexpensive compared to even what I bought them at, which is good. Very good for you. Yeah, the plant market's constantly changing. A lot of prices are currently coming down on a lot of plants. The second disclaimer that I have is that the ease of care is largely subjective, in that these are plants that have been easy for me and in my home, my environment, that sort of thing. I think it's still valuable information to share, but obviously your house might be different from mine, you know, your plant parent style might be different from mine. So do take some of what I say with a grain of salt, but I will be describing the general conditions that these plants have grown in and the general ways that I've cared for them. So if you feel like that meshes with your home and with your plant parent style, these plants may end up being easier for you as well. But yes, this is based on my own personal experience, so it's not necessarily an objective truth that these plants are going to be 100% easy 100% of the time for 100% of people. Right, so without further ado, let's just get into the first plant that I want to talk about. Which one do I want to talk about first? Wow, the sun's really coming out here. But the first plant that I want to talk about is my Philodendron Florida Ghost, which it is a cultivar of the Philodendron Florida, which is a cross between the Philodendron pedatum and the Philodendron squamiferum. Now, the fun thing about the Florida Ghost is that assuming you have this plant in fairly bright light, this is very light related, the leaves will come out pretty white, so this is a fairly decent example of that, or very, very light green, and then over time it will come down to a more green color, but it will often remain kind of minty looking, if you can see that. It definitely has still some streaks remaining of that fairly white color, but sometimes it goes back down to a very green color as well. So this is the most recent leaf that it put out. It has started getting fairly green at this point, but when it came out, it was a bit paler than this. They have these reddy stems as well that darken down to this color. And if you can hear grunting and that sort of thing, don't mind that because my newborn is sleeping, but newborns are noisy sleepers, so that grunting was him. And if you hear a child talking, that's my toddler that's playing. So we got the whole family featured. Anyway, I originally purchased this plant for somewhere in the realm of $90, I want to say, but it was much smaller than this because it's grown quite a bit, and I even chopped I think 3 leaves off of it as well to propagate. So there's that. I do think that the price has come down a little bit, but not a whole lot to my understanding based on what I've seen in the market currently. Now, I definitely expected this plant to be a lot more challenging than it actually is, but being that it is a hybrid and that it's a philodendron in general, philodendrons tends to be fairly easy plants, relatively speaking. You know, they're a little bit more drought tolerant, generally not incredibly picky when it comes to light and humidity, although obviously they would benefit from as much light and humidity as you're able to give them, you know. So this plant I have growing, I would say it's about 3 or 4 feet away from a grow light, like a pendant grow light. It is at the top of my plant shelf, so it's fairly close to the grow light, which I think helps with putting out lighter leaves. Now, I have heard of some people having the trouble of leaves coming out white and then staying white, kind of like this leaf down here. I personally haven't had that issue, but if you do, I would just experiment with how much light you're giving it. And sometimes it might just be a plant to plant thing, like genetically some plants may have that problem, others don't, so I don't know. As for humidity, it is close to a humidifier, but that humidifier is not always running, so typically it's just been growing in the ambient humidity of my home, which hovers around that 50% mark. And the soil that it comes in, I have not repotted it since I got the plant. It's definitely going to be in need of a repot soon, but the soil that it's in is of course a classic chunky aroid mix. I do not fertilize this guy on a super regular schedule. I really don't fertilize any of my plants on a regular schedule. I'm sure that he would probably benefit from that, like most plants would, but I just fertilize them with an organic fertilizer, and he seems to be fine with it. And yeah, with all of those conditions, he's basically constantly putting out new leaves. He's a very hardy plant. He has gotten spider mites a number of times, but none of the leaves have really sustained that much damage. I would say this leaf has gotten the most damage from spider mites. But other than that, you know, you really can't tell that he's had spider mites like 3 times, and he's bounced back really easily. I will say the one difficulty that I've had with this plant is with propagating it. Like I mentioned before, I've taken 3 node cuttings, like 3 different leaves, and like maybe a month ago or something like that, and none of them have rooted yet, which surprises me because typically philodendron are pretty easy to root, but this guy has been pretty tough to propagate. So I'd say that's maybe the one challenging part to this plant. But as far as care goes, he's always putting out new leaves, and I don't really have to think about caring about him that much. Next, I want to talk about my Anthurium clarinervium, which is actually the only Anthurium that I have in my collection. It is a velvet leaf Anthurium, which typically equates to being an Anthurium that is maybe a little bit more challenging to care for, but I would say based on what I've seen other people talking about, this is a fairly easy Anthurium. Obviously, that's not been everyone's experience ever, but for me, I have found that to be the case. I will say, when I first brought this Anthurium home, I got pregnant soon after and morning sickness hit, and so I was not watering it very consistently, and when that happened, and also I wasn't really refilling my humidifiers, and it was the winter time, so I will say this plant did suffer a little bit, and at least cosmetically. So this is one of the leaves that it had at the time. The other 2 leaves also had some of this crispiness on the edges, and that's just because of inconsistent watering, lack of humidity. And so there were 2 other leaves like this that eventually died off once these 2 leaves came in. But since these leaves have come in, I think that the plant has acclimated to my environment, because I haven't, you know, with the exception of trying to be more careful about watering, this plant really, I mean, neither of these leaves have any sort of crisping to the edges or anything like that, which is pretty encouraging. So I think, honestly, it seems like once the Anthurium clarinervium adapts to your environment, to your humidity levels, which that might be the case with like each individual leaf that comes out will adapt. That's kind of the idea. Like if it grows in your environment, it sort of adapts to it. Now, obviously it's within reason. Like if you don't have any humidity in your home whatsoever and you're never watering the plant, it's not going to adapt to that. But this plant has been in ambient like 50% humidity with some decent light, like medium to bright indirect light, and it's been growing fine, albeit a little bit slowly. Now again, I actually haven't repotted this plant either, but it has that nice chunky mix. This mix even has some leca in it, which is fun. But yeah, I just try to keep up with the watering of this plant. I don't let it dry out as much as my philodendron generally. Like I would never want to let this plant get bone dry, because that's when crispiness would happen and death and all that. But generally, I have found this to be unexpectedly easygoing, because I was a little bit concerned when I got this plant, because I don't own a greenhouse cabinet, at least not yet, or a grow tent or anything like that. And I was always sort of under the impression that velvet leaf anthurium would need greenhouse conditions. But I've just been growing this in my home and it's been happy. Again, been a little bit slow on growing. Part of that could just be because I neglected it for the first half of its time living in my home, just because I was pregnant and didn't really have the capacity to care for my plants. But the fact that this even survived that period of my plant care tells me that, you know, it's fairly hardy, relatively speaking. I think that a lot of other velvet leaf anthurium maybe wouldn't have survived that. So props to this guy. Now, I have heard some mixed reviews. Not everyone has had an easy experience with Anthurium clarinervium. It seems that some people are either like, oh, this is the easiest velvet leaf anthurium, and other people are like, oh my gosh, I just can't get a handle on this plant. So again, take that with a grain of salt. But I put a vote in for this being a relatively easy plant for me, at least. Yeah. If you want to, go for it. The price has been coming down on these guys. I got this one, I think, for $60, but I most recently saw a plant this size going for sale for like $40. So the price is coming down. May as well try it out if you think it's a pretty plant, you know? All right, next I want to talk about my Hoya linearis. This plant obviously looks pretty small, and it is pretty small, but to be fair, I grew it from like a tiny cutting, basically. So it's grown quite a bit in my care with not a whole lot of fuss other than trying to keep up with its watering. I will say, I think that this Hoya is more delicate and thirstier than other Hoya, and I keep it in this plastic pot that's in this terracotta pot because I like the look of the terracotta. But I have heard that Hoya linearis tend to like plastic containers more because, you know, they retain moisture, don't dry out quite as quickly. Obviously, don't waterlog it. I like having it in a clear pot because if I see that, like, you know, the moisture has gone down to like this level on the pot, I know it's time to water it, you know. I don't like to let this plant get completely bone dry. It's in ambient humidity again. I try to give this plant bright and direct light, but it's currently maybe more in medium indirect light, and it seems to really like that because it's been growing really fast. This is the type of plant that you don't necessarily always notice it growing, but then when you do blink and you're like, oh my gosh, this plant has grown so much. It's really rewarding. So I have heard some people struggling with smaller sizes of this plant. Like if you get this plant small, they struggle with it, but if it's a more established plant already, it seems to thrive, which that's been some other people's experience. For me personally, I got this plant really small and it has thrived for me without too much fussiness. Like I haven't had any root rot issues with it. In fact, my cats have knocked this down twice and it was like unpotted and everything, and it was fine, totally fine. I just scooped all the soil up and put it back in the pot and it was fine. So it's fairly resilient in my experience. I'm pretty sure I've taken a cutting from this portion and I put it back in the pot, just directly back into the soil. And I'm pretty sure it has rooted into the soil because when I tug it, you know, it has some resistance. I don't want to mess with it too much, but I'm pretty sure it just rooted directly in the soil. Oh, hello, sir. Are you okay? He's stirring a little bit. But yeah, Hoya linearis. It has been a lot easier than I expected it to be, all things considered. Next I'm going to talk about, wow, he just inserted himself into the frame right there. This is my Philodendron squamiferum, and this right here is the newest leaf on him, which is absolutely massive and beautiful. Now, you might recognize, I mentioned the squamiferum earlier when I talked about my Philodendron Florida Ghost and that they're related to each other. And you can kind of tell by that similar leaf shape that that is the case, and also the red stems. That's where it gets the red stems, because if you look at the Philodendron squamiferum, they've got pretty red stems and they're very, very fuzzy, or red petioles, excuse me, that's the proper term. I don't know why my brain went with stems, goodness. But yeah, this plant is a crazy grower and the leaves size up really, really fast. It's not even rooted into anything. It's just stable via this bamboo stake. So I'm honestly shocked that the leaves are sizing up so well, given that circumstance. I feel like I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, to be honest. When I first started collecting plants, this plant was definitely far more expensive than it is currently. It is getting way more accessible now. It's even shown up in some big box stores, which is super exciting. But I still wanted to include it because even though it's on the cheaper side now, it wasn't always, and it might still intimidate some people for that reason. So yeah, honestly, this plant has been nothing but easy. I have it in more of a medium light situation right now, and it's still just growing like crazy. I water it like my other philodendron, you know, just when the first few inches of the soil are dry, or I just remember to water it, that sort of thing. So yeah, it's pretty basic. I don't really have that much else to say, but it's a very beautiful plant and it's definitely worth getting, especially if you're into these fuzzy petioles, because that's a really cool plant to have in your collection. All right, next up is my variegated string of hearts, which this is another plant that's definitely getting a bit more accessible. You can definitely find a smaller pot of these for like 15 bucks, but if you want a nice big full pot, that'll probably run you closer to around $30 to $40, which is at least what I've seen in my area. I think they used to be more expensive. I remember them being more expensive than that. The variegated string of hearts, I just want to give you a good look at these leaves. They are just so beautiful and almost minty, and I love that like purpley pink that they've got going on along with the white. It's such a beautiful, beautiful plant. This is another plant that I grew from a fairly small cutting, kind of like the Hoya linearis, and it's taken off. I've propagated it successfully very easily, so that's why I'm putting it in this relatively easy category. Now, I've definitely had my fair struggles with strings of things and with string of hearts and that sort of thing. I know a lot of people have, but once you figure out their care, especially like according to your home and that sort of thing, they're really not that hard at all. Like honestly, I would say the key is to just give them bright light. They could even stand some direct light from your window, especially in like a west-facing window or south-facing window, something like that would probably be ideal. And don't skimp on watering. So I'll actually link Wild Fern's care video up above, because I think that encapsulates the best way to care for these guys. The big idea is don't skimp on watering, because a lot of people in the past I think would give the advice to water these only when they're like bone dry, but in my experience, I water them like I water my other plants, my philodendron. I don't let them get bone dry. I don't let them get wrinkly and squishy and that sort of thing. Like I just water them when I pick up the pot and it's a little bit lighter, or you know, I feel the soil is dry, or I know it's been a little while since I've watered them. But I try to not wait until I visibly see signs of distress, because at that point you probably already have some root loss and leaf loss if you let them get all wrinkly and that sort of thing. Like at the point where you see signs of underwatering or signs of them being thirsty, you know, the plant's already suffering. So I would avoid waiting that long. And yeah, if you do that, if you do those two things, they'll grow really nicely for you, at least in my experience. They really don't need any extra humidity or anything like that, or any extra pampering beyond those two things. And like I mentioned before, they're super easy to propagate. You can use either the butterfly method, where you just cut between the leaves and stick this bottom portion in soil or moss or whatever, and they grow individual vines from each of those nodes. Or honestly, what I did, I just cut a whole vine, took off a few of the leaves at each node, stuck it in water, and they rooted from the nodes that way. But there's plenty of videos online about propagating these guys if you're curious. But yeah, all in all, this is a plant that was a lot easier than I expected it to be. They're really not that hard if you water them. So yeah, don't be afraid to try it out, especially since the price is coming down. If it would make you feel more comfortable, start with just a regular string of hearts, and if you're successful with that, move on to a variegated string of hearts, because the care, in my experience, hasn't really been that different. Okay, and the last plant that I'm going to talk about today is my Hoya Mathilde. I would say this was the first rare Hoya that I got. It's a cross between the Hoya serpens and the Hoya carnosa, and the Hoya carnosa is just kind of your most common standard Hoya out there. So because of that, this is a very robust grower and pretty resilient, but you get the benefit of getting these little coin-shaped leaves from the Hoya serpens. Now, like I mentioned, this was the first rare Hoya that I got, and it was this tiny little pot for like 60 bucks. And I have noticed, there's a trend, obviously. The price has come down on these guys quite a bit, so get them. I mean, I think the price is pretty much cut in half from what I've seen in my area. I saw a 3-inch pot earlier this week for like 30 bucks. But yeah, they're super, super easy and fast growers, especially if you put them in the types of conditions that Hoyas enjoy. So I have this gal in a south-facing window, and she's just really popping off. She's got loads of growth points. So right here is one, there's one here, and another here, and even more all in there. She's also really easy to propagate. The way that I propagated her was in sphagnum moss in a prop box, and then I just took her out when she was ready, plopped her in the soil, and she didn't really miss a beat at all. I have her just in ambient humidity, like 50% humidity, and I water her like I water my other Hoya. I try to not let her get super wrinkly before I water her, because again, that means that the plant is probably stressed out. But I just water her when, the first couple of inches of soil are getting dry, and she seems pretty happy with that arrangement. So yeah, this is a very rewarding plant, a very fast growing Hoya, which is fun because sometimes Hoya can be slower growers for some people, especially if they're wrestling with certain pests. Just look at all of the little speckles on the leaves. Ugh, I love splashiness on Hoya. It's so fun. Well, those are all the plants that I was going to talk about for this video, but honestly, I feel like I could definitely make a part 2. I didn't include all of the plants that I possibly could have included because I didn't want this video to get absurdly long or anything like that. Also, there are some rare plants that I have that I just haven't had for a super long time yet, but I could see them being good candidates for a video like this. I just want to wait for a bit longer, be caring for them a bit longer before I'm totally confident in giving my vouch of, hey, these have been easy for me. You know what I mean? Yeah, let me know if you guys would be interested in seeing a part 2 to a video like this. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to give it a like, comment, subscribe, any of that. Honestly, I would love to hear, in your experience, have these plants been relatively easy in your collection and your care, or do you have other rare or uncommon plants that have been easy? Let me know. I hope that you have a wonderful and blessed day. Bye-bye.